This is King Rex coming at you with another video. This is how to win at fantasy football. This video is pretty much going to cover most of what you need to win at fantasy football. Can't cover 100% of everything, and it's not going to tell you players to pick or nothing like that. It's just going to be general guidelines to follow. First, we're going to go over the different types of leagues you can be in. The first type is redraft. This is the most common league setup. Every player is available in the draft every year. You do have to set a weekly lineup. You use waiver wires and free agency after the draft to make replacements on your roster. When the season's over, once again, everything resets and there's no long term commitment. So, to me, if you've never played fantasy football before, this is where you would want to start. Because if you do it and you don't like it, you can leave it in one season. You're not causing any issues for anyone else. They just have to replace you in the league. The next type is Dynasty. This one you build a team over several seasons. There's a startup draft the first year with all players available. After the first year, there are seasonal rookie drafts. Players are kept after the season, so everyone on your roster at the end of one year is on your roster at the beginning of the next year. You still have waivers and free agency, but they're not as important because Dynasty leagues tend to have a lot more players than redraft. Plus, they tend not to use kickers or defenses. So you'll have more players on teams, so there'll be less in free agency and waivers that are actually good. You still set weekly lineups, but it is expected to be a long-term commitment. If you join a Dynasty League either as a startup or if you take over someone else's team, you're expected to stay there for quite a while. So it's a long-term, it's more for fantasy veterans. Then there's a keeper league, which is kind of the mix between Dynasty and redraft. A set number of players can be kept. Sometimes it's just you can keep one player, two players, or three players. Sometimes it's unlimited, but you lose draft picks based on who you keep. And usually it's basically counts as one pick higher. So if you pick a guy in the third round one year, you want to keep him. He's your second round pick the next year. If you keep him again, he's your first round pick. Then after they're kept as a first round pick, they go back into the draft pool. The rules can differ widely on these. There's a yearly draft of all the non-keepers, so you do get, unless it's one of these ones that lets you keep a whole bunch of players from all different rounds, you get a whole, mostly new team every year. Once again, still uses waivers and free agency. Once again, you set up weekly lineups. There's a moderate commitment level because you are building not as much as Dynasty, but you are still building a team where you're keeping a few players. So I'd say this is probably someone at least knows fantasy football and's played a few seasons before they try a keeper league. Best ball is a different animal. You draft a new team every year, so it's like a redraft in that way, but there are no free agents and waivers. I think you draft usually 18 players or so, but you don't have no defense or kickers. Basically, what happens is you have all your players. Your best lineup is used every week after the fact. So if you have, let's say, Geno Smith and Tua Tagovailoa as your two quarterbacks, just throwing those names out there. Once the week is over, whoever had the better week, that counts as your quarterback, and the other one's on your bench. There is no free agency or waivers in this system. It's just whoever you draft. Everything resets for the next season. No long-term commitment. Most best ball is usually done online where people put money in and they each draft teams and there's a prize pool that comes out of that. I don't know, home leagues don't tend to do best ball. I think there's a thing called Fantasy Underdog that runs a lot of best ball. Number one thing is beyond what type of league you're in, because you have to know what type of league you're in, is to know your scoring. There's standard scoring, which does not give any points for receptions. It just gives points for when a player scores, they get points. For yards they accumulate, they get points. And if they turn the ball over, they lose points. And then defense has a little bit different scoring. PPR gives a point for every reception. Half PPR gives a half a point for every reception. And tight end premium is tied to PPR leagues where tight ends get a bonus, usually a half a point. It's half point in PPR, and half PPR might be a quarter of a point. Basically, these four different types give different values to players and positions. In PPR, wide receivers are more important because they're getting bonus points for catching the ball that running backs don't get as much because running backs don't catch the ball as much. Where standard probably favors running backs a little bit more, especially ones that run the ball a lot. Tight end premium really makes the tight ends that are at the top valuable because it really separates them from the rest of the pack of tight ends. People came up with that because they wanted the top players at each position to score a certain amount of points, but they didn't look at it based on how much better those players would be beyond the other players at their own position. And since you start a tight end, you're not just putting a tight end in the flex where you can start, just flex players. You have a lineup. It can make the top level tight ends just super valuable. You do have a completely different draft strategy with each of these settings. So you do need to know this. Like I said, you have to need to know what we've gone over so far, the type of league and the scoring system minimum before you start your fantasy football's season. But you should know more. Which is you should know all your league settings. Secondary scoring settings. A big one is a 4 point or a 6 point passing TD. Basically, because if they didn't do something to nerf quarterback scoring, all the top players would have been drafted would have been quarterbacks. And if you didn't draft early, you would have kind of been out in the cold. If you've ever, I played last year in a playoff fantasy league where everyone picked players for the playoffs. If you didn't get one of the good quarterbacks that were picked earlier or even to the middle of the round out of like 8 people, if you weren't the last few people picking, you were pretty much, you had no chance. In fact, the finishing order was almost the order in which people drafted. The only difference was the guy who drafted first finished second. But he wouldn't pick Josh Allen because he's a Steelers fan and the Steelers were playing him. And he wouldn't pick Lamar Jackson because he doesn't like the Ravens because he's a Steelers fan. So if he'd have picked the quarterback better, he would have finished first. Also, you need to know your lineup makeup. It's usually a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, a tight end, a flex, a kicker, and a defense. Some people have multiple flexes. Some people have 2 quarterbacks. Some have 3 receivers. There's some leagues where they have what's called a super flex, where you can put a quarterback in there, which basically makes it a 2 quarterback league because they score the most points. So that makes a big difference. So they use individual defensive players. They use a defense. They use a kicker. These can vastly change your draft strategy, and it can vastly change player values because if you have 6 point passing touchdowns, quarterbacks that throw a lot of touchdowns go up a lot in value. If quarterbacks don't throw a lot of touchdowns, they become worthless even if they get a lot of yards. So the 6 point TD, I think, really unbalances things. If you're going to use 6 point TD, passing TD, I think you almost have to up the yards and then the quarterbacks are too valuable. I think it's better to move just do touchdowns by position rather than by how they're scored if you're wanting to make the passing and rushing touchdowns equal for a quarterback. Know your league mates. Granted, if you first join a league, you're not going to, but you kind of want to take mental notes. This can give you big advantage drafting, knowing the other's tendencies. If you know a guy drafts quarterbacks early, well, you can kind of know if they draft. You can know that, hey, if I don't pick a quarterback, they might grab one. And if they don't pick quarterbacks early, you can kind of know that, and you might be able to move quarterback down the list. You also can get ahead of streamers on the waiver wire and in free agency. If you know someone else is going to be streaming defenses, maybe you pick your defense up a week early and just use a roster spot for a defense for a week out so you can have a better defense every week. I did that last year and it really worked out for me at the end of the season. You also might get insight on trading with certain team managers. Some people are not even worth trying to trade with because they want way more value than their players ever worth, where other people can be more reasonable. You might also know if people can be negotiated with more or not. So knowing your league mates really puts you on the next level. It's kind of like knowing your opponent. You can play fantasy football in a vacuum and not pay attention to what everyone else is doing, but it's going to hurt you. The fantasy football formula is generally called talent times opportunity equals success, but this is not correct. It's efficiency times opportunity equals success. Talented player can be inefficient. Last year, Josh Jacobs and Devontae Adams, both on the Raiders, were not efficient, especially in the first half of the season when Josh McDaniels was coaching them. Then after he was fired, they started playing better. But the system was still bad because they still had a mediocre quarterback play. The offensive line wasn't very good. So they're talented players, but they weren't efficient, so they weren't as good as they could have been. They'd have been in a better situation. And efficient players aren't always talented. You can see guys in the league where they're just in a really good situation, so they're pretty efficient basically because they're in a perfect spot. So fantasy football is also a game of opportunity cost. If you pick a guy up off the waiver wire, you're having to drop someone else, or you're also having to prioritize people on the waiver wire. Say there's three guys you want to pick off the waiver wire, you have to put them in the order that you want them. And when you're drafting, you pick in a player, and you pick someone, there's other players you're not going to be able to get. So it's a big game of opportunity cost. You do have to pay attention to the opportunity cost when you pick players, when you do waiver wire deals, even when you set your lineup. If you put player A in your lineup, player B on your bench, there's the opportunity cost of what player B is going to do. So always think of the opportunity cost of your decisions. A big thing is to have a draft strategy. The draft is the biggest factor in success in fantasy football. There's a saying that goes, you can't win your league in the draft, but you can lose it. I've actually seen the last 2 years where guys came close to winning it, mostly on their draft because they didn't need to make a lot of moves after the draft because they basically the players they got didn't bust or disappoint. So you can win your league in the draft. Also, so when you are drafting, pay attention to the draft board. I'd say you create a value-based draft sheet, which I will go over later. And you should always think of what players or what types of players would be left after the draft. If you're playing in a standard scoring league, there might not be very good tight ends left after the draft, so you have to consider that. You still need waivers, free agency, and trades, but having a good draft strategy will definitely help you. I'd say the factors in fantasy success is 40% on how you draft, 20% luck, 20% in season moves or trades, and waiver wire and free agency, and 20% of your lineup decisions. So the draft is probably twice as important as anything else. There are different draft strategies out there. There's a robust running back where you just pick a whole bunch of running backs at the beginning. Not only running backs, but you really go after running backs. There's a hero running back where you pick one really good running back in the first or second round and then try to fill out all your other positions and get some guys lower down that you hope pan out. There's a zero running back where you don't pick a running back for the first 4 rounds. There's running back where you pick two running backs as the first two picks. There's the same thing with wide receiver where you pick wide receiver at the beginning. Zero wide receiver, you could even probably do a hero wide receiver. My draft last year was kind of a hero wide receiver because I picked one wide receiver in the first 6 picks. And it was my second round pick, CeeDee Lamb, so he really worked out. And if not for a rash of injuries, I would have won the title. You can also do elite quarterback where you pick a top level quarterback probably in the second or third round. But all these strategies, if you do use them, you have to know all of them because you should pick one based on how the draft unfolds. If you're thinking wide receiver, and you're picking 12th, and you got 2 picks sitting there, and it unfolds that Bijan Robinson and Jonathan Taylor are sitting there, they're probably the 2 players you should pick, even if you wanted to go wide receiver. Maybe not in full PPR, but even those guys get some targets. Like I think Bijan Robinson was the 3rd most targeted running back last year in the passing game, so he's going to catch a lot of passes. On the other side, if you want running back, but all the top running backs are picked and the best players are wide receivers or other positions, maybe you ought to shift over to that or at least one wide receiver. So your strategy should be based on what's going on, not on a predetermined strategy. Value-based drafting is pretty easy. You create a draft sheet, use projections for each player. You calculate the value over replacement using the last starter at each position. So in that typical league where 12 quarterbacks start, you make a value that would put the 12th quarterback at 0 and every point scored above him that's expected would be added to the top player and every player level before be deducted. Don't forget to count flex spots. The way I count flex spots is I give half those spots to the running backs and half those spots to the wide receivers. So if you have 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and 1 flex in a 12-team league, It'd be 24 for the two spots, and then another 6, so it'd be 30 and 30. You want to rank all players against each other, not just against their positions. We use this as a guide when drafting, but you don't follow it religiously. Here's my draft sheet from last season. I haven't made one yet for this season because it's too early to make a draft sheet, in my opinion. Last year, the number one guy was Travis Kelce on expectation because he expected to score almost 100 points more than the tight end 12 was. Now, that didn't happen because a lot of good tight ends emerged last year, and he had kind of a down year. Same thing with Mahomes, Henry. Although Henry was a lot that the Titans just kind of fell apart. They've gotten worse every year, pretty much since 2019. Josh Allen might have been close. In fact, I think his value replacement number was higher than that 84 points. I think it was over 100 points. You can kind of get on like Christian McCaffrey was, but this is just based off projection. I used Fantasy Pros and ESPN, figured the average, and took that off. And I did like 220 players, but this is just the top 25. Some of these guys didn't perform that well. Some of them outperformed it. Like a guy like Nick Chubb and Austin Eckler that were injured, of course, they didn't perform as well. Bijan was expected to go absolutely insane last year. I kind of thought they had him too high. Then the ADP is where they were being drafted. So Kelce looked like a big deal. Mahomes looked like a big deal. So you could probably get some of these guys cheaper than their value of replacement. So that's why you'd also look at that because if you're picking high, you're going to pick Josh Allen when you could probably get him in the second round. In the first round, probably not. But if you're seeing someone like Jamar Chase, you're going to have to probably take him right away because he was going third overall. Draft strategy things to consider is tailor a strategy to your league, especially the scoring type. Have a flexible tight end strategy. This means are you going to go for an elite tight end? Maybe kind of like one of those second or third tier tight ends, or are you going to just pick two guys at the end, kind of take two shots and hope one of them hit? Same way with the quarterback. Elite, like kind of a top next second level guy, or just kind of take two guys that you're hoping one of them hit. You do have to be risk averse early in the draft. Don't pick super risky players in the first 4 or 5 picks. Maybe one guy up there, but that would be it. Because if you pick a couple risky guys, chances are one of them's going to bite you. You want to go after the high upside later on in the draft. So picking guys that have a good floor late in the draft doesn't really mean anything because they don't have any upside. They're not going to help you. There's going to be guys that sit on your bench, or if you do use them, they're probably not going to do much for you. You'll probably be able to find someone that good on the waiver wire anyway. Don't pick a kicker or defense until the last 2 rounds unless none have been picked. So if you're sitting there and you're getting ready to pick on the 13-14 turn, you're right at the end there. No one's picked a kicker or defense. I could see grabbing a kicker or defense at that point because the opportunity cost isn't going to hit you that bad, even if it's 13-14 turn or 14-15, because they're going to have to, as long as they're in a league that makes them pick kickers and defenses, they're going to have to pick those two. So you must get to pick it a letter there and just do a dart throw on your last pick or two. So that's not a bad strategy. Don't draft a player just because he's really good for you in the past, because I know some people do that, but maybe you just got him in a really good year. Maybe the circumstances change. I know guys that like certain players because they perform for them, so they'll keep picking them. And sometimes that's not a great strategy. Now, you should look at past performance to see how good someone will do, but don't just grab a guy because he was good for you in the past. Other things to consider for fantasy football as a whole: don't panic. Just because a guy's a bad week or two at the beginning of the season doesn't mean you have to trade him and unload him right away. Also, don't overreact. This is a big thing, especially I see on a lot of the YouTube videos. A guy has a big week and they act like, this is a must-have guy. A little bit of hype comes out of training camp. The guy shoots up the draft boards. The situation gets a little bit better. They act like it's a magic wand has been there. People overreact a lot in fantasy football, especially in rankings, so don't overreact. Take those things with a grain of salt. They do have to create content. Now, some guys create really good content, but they do have to create content. That's how they make a living. I'm not saying never again to a player or a team. I did this one time. I said, I had the Redskins quarterback in 2019. I picked him up because he had 3 straight games of 20 fantasy points. He threw 3 passes, and one of them was intercepted, and he got benched and was done for the year. And I'm like, the Redskins, I'll never have another player on the team again. But I've had guys since that actually performed well for me after I got rid of that never again attitude after a couple of years. Also, don't be afraid to have too many players on one team. This happened to me last year, kind of early in the year. I had CJ Stroud. I had Nico Collins. I had Damian Pierce, who was a bust, and the kicker all at once. And I thought about grabbing Singletary and Tank Dell both. I'm like, do I really want any more Houston Texans? I probably should have wanted more Houston Texans. I was just kind of afraid to go too much on that one team, which don't be afraid to do that. Also remember, teams change throughout the season. If a guy's really doing well at the beginning of the year, something could change to cause him to not be getting the ball anymore. Maybe someone comes back. Maybe he goes through injuries. An injury to another player could change it because, like, maybe a quarterback really favors one receiver. He gets injured, so when the backup comes in, he doesn't show that favoritism. 1 year or 1 week isn't a trend. I see this a lot where a player will be mediocre for a long time, have 1 year, and they'll act like it's a can't miss that he's going to repeat. That our player's been injured every year for several years in a row, and he makes it through one season without getting injured, and they're like, he's no longer injury prone. It's like making it through 1 year doesn't make you not injury prone anymore. You have to go through a few years. I remember the upside wins championships. So when you're getting players in the draft and trades and free agency off the waiver wire, kind of go for guys that got upside. I remember that even the experts can be wrong. No one's right all the time, so you can go against the grain. Remember that if you're really paying attention to your team, that you got like 16 players on, you might, if you're really, looking at things, these experts are looking at hundreds of players across 32 teams. They may not know that one player as well as you do. I'm not saying that you shouldn't listen to experts at all, but they can be wrong. But sometimes it's best just to go with your gut, and then rather say, well, the experts say this, and maybe they just, maybe they overlooked something. And a lot of times when one expert makes a pronunciation, they kind of all fall in line. So that's why you'll see the same thing. They kind of copy off each other. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and have a great day.